Hello learners, welcome to this module on the anatomical structure of the respiratory tract. If I ask you what is respiration, I am sure all of you would answer that respiration is a vital process. Yes, respiration is a vital process, and it is believed that the process of respiration began during creation itself, when God Himself breathed into the nostrils of man to make man a living being. By definition, what is respiration? You may recall, even from your memory in school, a good definition for the term respiration. Nevertheless, in the simplest terms, respiration is the process by which oxygen is breathed in and carbon dioxide is breathed out. It is the vital process of gaseous exchange between the environment and the organism by which oxygen from the atmosphere is delivered to the tissues and carbon dioxide from the tissues is sent back into the atmosphere. From the picture here, you can clearly see that respiration occurs in two phases, namely inspiration or inhalation, during which air enters the lungs from the atmosphere, and expiration or exhalation, when air leaves the lungs. You may also remember that during normal or tidal breathing, inspiration is an active process and expiration is passive. So now we understand that respiration is a vital process of gaseous exchange by which oxygen is inhaled and carbon dioxide is exhaled. Next, we will go on to the types of respiration. Respiration is categorized into two types, namely external respiration, which involves the exchange of respiratory gases between the lungs, that is the alveoli, and blood, and internal respiration, which involves exchange of gases between blood and tissues. Now, the process of respiration proceeds in four phases. You can see here a simplified diagram of the four phases of respiration. In phase 1 or ventilation phase, there is a pulmonary ventilation or gaseous exchange between atmospheric air and pulmonary capillary blood. In the second phase or transport phase, oxygen is transported from the lungs to the tissues. In the third phase or exchange phase, there is actual gaseous exchange between systemic blood and tissues. And in the fourth or the last phase, when oxygen is delivered to the tissue for metabolism of foods to produce energy and carbon dioxide produced in the tissues is removed from the tissues. This phase is called the tissue phase. It is also called as cellular respiration. Now I hope you have comprehended the types and phases of respiration. Let us now move on to the actual anatomical structure of the respiratory tract. We move on to the second question now. What is meant by the respiratory tract? The respiratory tract is in fact a series of conducting passages for the air from the atmosphere to the lungs and back. By definition, the anatomical structure through which air moves in and out is called the respiratory tract or the respiratory system. From the illustration here, you can see that the respiratory tract begins with the nose and ends with the most terminal alveoli in the lung parenchyma. It consists of the nose or nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and finally the lungs. Depending upon its structure and functional anatomy, the respiratory tract is demarcated into two distinct parts. The first part, as you can see from the diagram, is the upper respiratory tract or the URT, which extends from the nostrils to the vocal cord, including the paranasal sinuses, glottis, pharynx and the larynx. And the second part, namely the lower respiratory tract or the LRT, extending from the vocal cord to the alveoli, that is the trachea, airways and the alveoli. The respiratory apparatus or the entire part where the mechanism of respiration takes place, however, also includes the thoracic cavity and the associated skeletal muscle and the muscles of respiration. Now coming to the first region, that is the upper respiratory tract, it humidifies the inspired air and raises it to attain body temperature by the time it reaches the trachea. It consists of the nostrils, the paranasal sinuses, the pharynx and the larynx. Now let us see about the first region or the nostrils. The nostrils contain the olfactory epithelium and perform the function of olfaction or smell sensation. The nostrils usually filter particles greater than 10 microcentimeters. The nostrils also make some nasal secretions. These secretions contain immunoglobulins and interferons, and these secretions can kill microbes which enter the nasal cavity. Here you must understand that though the volume of the nostrils is only 20 milliliters, yet the cross-sectional area is increased several times by the nasal turbinates. Nasal turbinates are the bone and soft tissue inside the nose. There are three nasal turbinates, the superior, middle and inferior, and these increase the area inside the nostrils. The nostrils account for 50% of resistance to airflow in the respiratory system, and this resistance is increased during viral infections like common cold. The next region of our interest is constituted by the paranasal sinuses. There are 4 paranasal sinuses present around the nasal passages, as you can see in the illustration. The first one is the maxillary sinus, and these are the largest part of the paranasal sinuses. These are found under the eyes in the maxillary bones. The next are the sphenoid sinuses, and these are found in the sphenoid bone. The ethmoidal sinuses are found between the nose and the eyes, and the frontal sinuses are placed superior to the eyes in the hard part of the forehead. The paranasal sinuses perform 3 major functions, that is, they offer resonance to voice, they lighten the skull, making upright posture easier, and they protect the brain during facial trauma or injury. The next region of the respiratory tract is the pharynx. This also consists of 3 regions, namely the naso, oro, the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is located behind the nostrils and extends from the posterior nares to the level of the soft palate. The eustachian tubes. Now, I should ask you, what are the eustachian tubes? Now, these are the auditory tubes or the tubes which link the nasopharynx to the middle ear. These eustachian tubes and the posterior nares open into the nasopharynx. The oropharynx is located behind the mouth from the soft palate to the level of the hyoid bone. The laryngopharynx starts from the hyoid bone and opens into the esophagus. The next region is the larynx, and this consists of the epiglottis, the arytenoids and the vocal cords. The function of the epiglottis and the arytenoids is to cover the vocal cord during deglutition or swallowing and prevent aspiration of food into the respiratory tract. You may recall from your experience that the arytenoids enlarge and swell during infections. This increases resistance to airflow. The next region of our interest is the lower respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract, as you can see from the diagram, is a series of tubes and tubules called the airway tree and the lungs. A series of branching tubes constitute the airway tree. The main airway is constituted by the trachea, which is a cartilaginous and membranous tube of about 10 or 11 centimeters long. It is nearly cylindrical, flattened posteriorly with an external diameter of about 2 centimeters in the adult male and 1.5 centimeters in the female. It is kept patent by incomplete C-shaped rings of cartilage on its anterolateral wall, which keeps the air tube open, as you can see in the diagram. The trachea branches into two principal bronchi. Each bronchi enters a lung and branches several times into progressively smaller bronchi and bronchioles. This system of tubes is called the tracheobronchial tree. The progressively branching tubules are denoted by their generation numbers. The trachea is called the zero generation, the right and left bronchi being the first generation, and so on in increasing order of numbers or integers. As the generation number increases, you can observe the following changes in the tubes. The diameter of the airways decreases, making them narrower and shorter. The amount of cilia also decreases progressively. The number of mucus secreting cells decreases. The quantity of submucosal glands become less, and the amount of cartilage in the tubular wall decreases. The airways progressively branch 23 times, constituting 23 generations of airways. You can observe from the diagram that they form the conducting zone or the conducting airways and the respiratory zone. The conducting airways get its name because of the function it performs. It moves the air by convection into the gas exchange area of the lungs, and therefore it is called as the conducting zone. This zone is formed by the trachea and the first 16 generations of airways, namely the trachea, bronchi and bronchioles. In this zone, the inspired air is warmed and humidified. The air is evenly distributed into the deeper parts of the lungs. This area also provides non-specific defense system of the body by way of removing dust, bacteria and harmful gases from the respiratory tract. Another important feature of the conducting zone is the amount of cartilage they contain. This affects their physiological function. The first 4 generations of the conducting zone contain substantial amount of cartilage. The cartilage prevents the collapse of these airways even though there are changes in thoracic pressures. The amount of cartilage is present up to the 10th generation, and these tubes are referred to as the bronchi. In bronchioles, cartilage is totally absent. The smallest airways in the conducting zone are the terminal bronchioles. These bronchioles lack cartilage. Even then, the elasticity of the lung tissue maintains their patency and they are suspended in the elastic tissue of the lung parenchyma. Now, we come to an important point, that is the anatomical dead space. The region up to the 16th generation of airways is called the anatomical dead space. Do you know why? It is because there are no alveoli up to the 16th generation of airways and hence no gaseous exchange can occur in this region of the conducting zone. Therefore, by definition, the volume of respiratory tract starting from the nose to the 16th generation of airways is called the anatomical dead space. The next region we have to see about is the respiratory zone. As I told you earlier, the airway tree has two distinct regions, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. From the figure, you can see that the last 7 generation of airways form the respiratory zone and are the site for gaseous exchange. This zone is formed by the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts and the actual alveoli. Alveoli are seen on bronchioles from the 17th generation onwards, and the bronchioles from the 17th to 19th generation are called as the respiratory bronchioles. The alveoli descend into the lungs, and with their descent, the generation number increases. Generations 20 to 22 are the alveolar ducts, which finally terminate in the alveolar sac or the 23rd or the last generation. Now, let us stop for a minute and summarize our knowledge on the respiratory tree. You can refer to the diagram and see for yourself that the main airway tree is formed by the trachea. Recall that it is generation 0. It divides into the right and left principal bronchi, generations 1 to 16. 0 to 16 forms the conducting zone. It has substantial cartilage but no alveoli whatsoever. Region with no gaseous exchange and therefore called as the anatomical dead space. Tubes 17 to 19 are called as the respiratory bronchioles. These contain less cartilage, more alveoli. Ducts 20 to 22 are called as the alveolar ducts. They also contain no cartilage and more alveoli. And finally, generation 23 is formed by the alveolar sacs. From generation 17 to generation 23, they form the respiratory zone. Now, we come to the question of the source of blood supply to the lungs. Blood is supplied to the conducting zone from the bronchial circulation. The bronchial circulation is fed by the bronchial artery. The bronchial artery originates from the descending aorta. The lungs have an intricate and extensive capillary network which occupies about 80% of the alveolar surface areas. The capillaries bring the blood from the pulmonary circulation into close proximity with the alveolar air, and this helps in the easier diffusion of gases through the alveolo-capillary membrane. The alveolus, as you know, is the functional unit of gas exchange. There are about 400 million alveoli present in both lungs in adults. The diameter of the alveoli ranges from 75 to 300 millimeters, resulting in a total surface area of about 50 to 100 square meters. This, you might be surprised, is roughly the size of a tennis court. This makes the alveoli one of the largest biological membranes in the body. The blood is drained from the alveolar apparatus by the pulmonary veins. The next organ of our interest are the lungs. These are the seat for gaseous exchange. From your earlier lessons in school and your undergraduate physiology, you will remember that the pleura is the covering of the lungs. It has two layers, namely the parietal which is the outer sac containing blood vessels, and the visceral pleura, which forms the inner covering and lies directly on the lungs. The parietal pleura produces the parietal fluid, which is an ultrafiltrate of the plasma. About 10 to 20 milliliters of pleural fluid is found in the pleural cavity, which is the space between the two layers of pleura. The pleural fluid forms a lining about 10 millimeters thick in density between the pleural layers and acts as a lubricant, allowing the chest wall to slide against the lungs. This facilitates the change in shape and size of the lungs during respiration and protects against external damage. The next organ we are going to see about are the lobes of the lungs. The right lung has 3 lobes and constitutes about 55% of the total lung mass and function, and the left lung has 2 lobes and contributes to the remaining 45% of mass and function of the lungs. The lung consists of the vascular and the airway trees that are embedded in the elastic connective tissue of the lung parenchyma. The next aspect of our study are the bronchopulmonary segments. The bronchopulmonary segment is that part of the lungs which is supplied by a segmental bronchus. There are about 10 bronchopulmonary segments in the right lung and 9 in the left lung. These are the apical, posterior, anterior, lateral, medial, superior, medial basal, anterior basal, lateral basal, and posterior basal segments. Each bronchopulmonary segment is a single functional unit. Next, we move on to the final aspect of this module, namely the respiratory unit. The respiratory unit is the terminal part of the respiratory tree wherein the actual exchange of gases takes place. You can observe from the figure that it starts from the respiratory bronchioles. Each respiratory bronchiole divides into alveolar ducts, each of which enters an enlarged sac called the alveolar sac. The space inside the alveolar sac is called the antrum. The wall of the alveolar ducts and the sac contain numerous alveoli. The respiratory unit thus includes the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, antrum, and the alveoli. Each one of the alveolus looks like a tiny pouch with a diameter of about 0.2 to 0.5 millimeters, and it is lined by the epithelial cells. These epithelial cells are of 2 types. They are called the type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. Type 1 cells are squamous and constitute about 95%. These provide the site for gaseous exchange between the alveoli and the blood. Type 2 cells are cuboidal and secrete the alveolar fluid and the surfactant. Now I think you can recall that the alveolo-capillary membrane is a dual membrane formed by the membranes of the alveolus and the capillary tuft or the network surrounding it. So this membrane is called as the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane thus is the membranous structure through which gaseous exchange takes place. The capillaries in the lungs form a network beyond the terminal bronchiole in the respiratory unit. These capillaries are formed by endothelial cells. The alveolar and the capillary membrane together form the respiratory membrane, and the membrane separates the air in the alveoli from the blood in the capillary. This respiratory membrane has a surface of about 70 square meters and a thickness of about 5 microns and thus the fundamental unit of filtration in the lungs. To conclude, respiration is a vital process. Its initiation denotes the beginning and its cessation the end of life. It operates through a complex group of organs, tissues and chemical substances which facilitate the physical movement of air inside the air passages and those which help in the transfer of gases between blood and air. It can therefore rightly be said in conclusion that respiration is a fundamental process which sustains all other physiological processes. Thank you.